Hi, I'm Stephen Carson coming at you from St. Louis, Missouri in these United States. I'll make it short and sweet and get to the meat of the stream, which is that gratefully received support for the channel from Unsubscribestar. You can find that in the video description on YouTube. And most people donate $5 a month, cheap, but that stuff adds up, helps me cover various costs of the show. All right, we are bringing on some folks. In fact, let's see, I'll do it like this first. No, I don't like that. How about, no? There, how about that? Okay, Ryan, welcome.
Hello, how are you doing, Stephen?
Doing very good. And you have, I don't know if we want to get into details, but you have been sojourning at various conferences for a couple weeks, so been away from the show, but I think time worthy spent in various ways. One of those conferences you were, week-long things you were at was with my daughter, and she had a great time. In fact, we had one of the guys you made friends with staying with us last night on his way to college. So.
Right, yeah, and that was at Mises U, which is right. Always a pleasure to be there.
All right. Yeah, this is a week-long boot camp. I guess I should mention it in case we have people who were like you several years ago, somehow watching this when they're 14 or whatever. Well, that was more than several years ago now. But yeah, just mention that if you find Austrian economics interesting, there is a week-long boot camp each summer. I call it a boot camp. Makes it sound, it's just you're sitting listening to lectures basically and staying up all night debating things. But
it's a series of lectures that build up economics from the ground up, and you start the week with a much more general and broad view, like how does money develop, what is entrepreneurship, praxeology, and then you end the week with very specific topics like policing. The economics of policing was a very good one. That was a lecture given by Tate Fagley
nice.
This year. And then we had Carl Frederick Israel gave a very good lecture on the business cycle and the effects that have, or part of the lecture was the effects that it has on society, transferring wealth from younger generations to older, from specific parts of society to other more wealthy parts. Two very specific things, but very, very good nonetheless. It was a very enjoyable time this year. And then, of course, the evening debates and discussions that go until like 3 a.m.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh, I forgot. This was your second time doing this. That's right. And then Mad Mercenary, once again joining us 2 weeks in a row. This is exciting, sir.
Thank you for having me on.
And Mad Merc is doing his usual good back in his co-host role here of reminding me about the art contest we have at the end of the year each year. We haven't quite figured out what we're going to do this year yet, but just thought I'd mention that we should be announcing that soon, what the what the challenge will be. We've done currency design in the past. We've done book cover design. I feel like I'm missing some things. Anyway, and we bring on some artist friends, usually between Christmas and New Year's, have a special end of the year stream and do some judging and some handing out of prizes. And I think it's pretty awesome.
Flags, because that's the one that you missed.
Flags, yeah, there's one. Flag, vexillology, yes. You learn so much watching this channel and things you wouldn't expect. Okay, so we are going to return to a book that we started. I started with Black Horse a couple months ago and just haven't gotten back to it. And so talked to Black Horse and decided I would just continue it with Ryan and Mad Merc here. Where is my chat here? Okay, in the live chat, here is part 1 of Mutual Aid, which we called Bread and Circuses. And that is now in the live chat. And Black Horse and I covered chapter 1 of this book, which gets into some of the fun stuff like the Society of Odd Fellows. I just love the name of that. and why they would use secret handshakes and stuff like this. There was actually a very practical reason. But the main point, and this is what we'll continue with as we cover chapter 2 of this book, the main point is that mutual aid of various sorts, there were all kinds of different organizations, different ways of doing it, and some very informal, some more formal. Mutual aid was ubiquitous in American society. And I gather, this book is focused on the US, but I gather from other things I've seen, it was pretty much ubiquitous across at least the Anglosphere. I can't speak to the continent. I don't know that history. But at least the Anglosphere, you saw this in Canada, you saw it in Australia, the UK, etc. This was, for a lot of people, the primary way that they received support. It wasn't through a centralized government program. The primary way, there might have been a little bit of that around, but for most people, most of the time, like, by which I mean like 99% of the time, if you had help, if you had life insurance, if you had help, if you got sick, the man of the house got sick and couldn't work for a while, it was through some form of mutual aid. Of course, Clossington in the chat says he joined the Oddfellows a few months ago. I mean,
Clossington's playing a collect them all game with all the different lodges and organizations. That's why. Yeah.
Got it. Okay.
We are a scattered community.
Right. Okay, so let's bring this on. How do I do that? Over here. Yeah. Okay, so let's take a look at this. Oh, by the way, the book, and I will drop the Amazon link. I was just sharing it with Clossington, so you'd think it'd be handy, but let me pull it back up. The book is by a fellow named David Beito, Beito, and it's called From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State, Fraternal Societies and Social Services, 1890 to 1967. You'll be relieved to know that what we'll be covering, like we were with chapter 1, is sort of the happy part of the story. And that is where mutual aid societies are ubiquitous. And it just talks about how they functioned and everything, as we'll see, gets in the mechanics, which I think are of great relevance to us personally. But he does take the story up to 67 and takes it to the welfare state. So we are going to see the end of the story, if we stick with this book, get to the bitter end. And that is where a lot of this stuff was pretty much wiped out. I mean, of course, there's still things around, but in terms of the way it functioned in society, how ubiquitous it was, it really got wiped out. Okay, I've dropped a link to the book in there. So let's get right into chapter 2 of David Beito's book, From Mutual Aid to the Welfare State. So chapter 2 is called Teaching Habits of Thrift and Economy. He covers a lot of things here, but as the title suggests, he points out that if you simply think of these things as like a money contract, all they are is an insurance deal. We're going to enter into this thing and we're going to put money into it. And then if we fall on hard times, then we'll pull money out. If you only think of it as that, you're thinking a little too narrowly, a little too materialist, reductionist mode, right? These societies not only had that monetary aspect, which we'll talk about, but they had other aspects of joining together and what some of the benefits were of that. Okay, so he starts out, because he's going to focus a little bit here on the immigrant communities in the late 19th and early 20th century. He starts out by mentioning that 18 million individuals entered American ports between 1890 and 1920. So it was a big influx of immigration, and controversially at the time, if you can imagine immigration being controversial, controversially, these were primarily folks who were not from the countries that had provided the original settlers. it was Eastern and Southern Europe, Catholics, Jews, Greek Orthodox, and so quite a bit different than the original WASP old immigrants.
Or even the Central European immigrants. That was you'll get told about the 1840 waves of immigration that's usually critiqued as very bad and lawless, but even then, Irishmen, Germans, Central Europeans like the Bohemians and all that, we've had those in the area of the United States before, even in the colonies. We never had a significant Polish, Italian, Jewish, or Greek part of the country. It was entirely new. Completely different and uncontacted cultures crossing each other like they haven't had before.
I'm distracted thinking about how jokes about Polish people were so ubiquitous when I was a child, and I haven't heard one in years. I don't know what happened there. They got some PR or something. Okay, so there was 18 million coming in from Eastern and Southern Europe, right? Primarily, mostly. Also, by 1930, 1.2 million blacks had settled in the North, and we'll talk a bit about these immigrant black populations, in this case, immigrating primarily from the South to the North. Okay, that's interesting. Okay, 90. Okay, yeah, to put 18 million in context, Robert Strickland in the chat says the U.S. Census population in 1890 was about 63 million. So bringing in 18 million on top of 63, that's really significant immigration.
Yeah. New England hasn't recovered to this day. New England hasn't recovered to this day. New England and the Mid-Atlantic, you'll have, if you look at a European heritage map by county, what used to be a stronghold of Dutch, Anglo, and Old Germanic populations, which were, in New England, New York City, that area. This is the time period where that turns to Italian, Polish, Jewish, and all the other stuff. This is where you start getting the sort of modern ethnic makeup of that part of the country. It's completely changed and hasn't changed back ever since.
Right. Yeah, I mean that's huge, 18 million, and I have to wonder where the population was. The original 63 million were in 1890, and where these 18 million came, because I don't think they were distributed evenly throughout the United States, right? They were heavily concentrated in New York and
Boston.
Just like all immigration, usually these communities try to stick together when they enter into a new nation. It's not just America where they do this. It's a natural phenomenon where they will gather in a single place and create their own ethnic enclaves within a nation, in particular cities.
So a little more to detail from the book to paint the immigration picture over 130 years ago, or 120 years ago here. By 1900, 4 in 10 people in the largest cities were foreign born, while an additional 2 in 10 were children of immigrants. Oh, I see. So he's saying that 6 out of 10 in the largest cities were either born elsewhere or the children of people born elsewhere. So they were first generation or second generation immigrants, right? Wow. 6 out of 60%. Wow. Okay. Anyway, some people were not entirely happy with this. Robert Hunter wrote in his well-known treatise, Poverty, that the evils of immigration, if they are to be called evils, are not temporary. The direct descendants of the people who fought for and founded the Republic and gave us a rich heritage of democratic institutions are being displaced by the Slavic, Balkan, and Mediterranean peoples. Balkan, really?
Greek.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Right. Okay, anyway, so that paints the backdrop of what's going on at this period we're looking at, this period of mutual aid from like about 1890 to 1910, 1920. So yeah, as Mad Merc was saying, all these different ethnic and national groups work together. So they erected a formidable network of individual and collective self-help for protection. And he makes a distinction now between hierarchical relief and reciprocal relief. So hierarchical relief, and this is part of the reason I wanted to go through this book on the show. is that when we think of charity, welfare, so on and so forth, we think I think we think in terms of hierarchical relief, and that is large bureaucratic formalized institutions. Reciprocal relief, though, is something that particularly interests me, and I would love to see more of a return to that. Reciprocal relief tends to be decentralized, spontaneous, informal. With hierarchical, the donors usually come from a different background than the recipients, whereas in reciprocal relief, it's literally people helping each other of a similar, ethnicity, income, same walks of life, right? And I love this phrase. I don't know why I didn't highlight it. I'll highlight it now. Today's recipient could be tomorrow's donor, right? That's the picture of reciprocal relief.
Just one small note here.
It's like the golden rule. I help you because that could be me tomorrow, right? Go ahead. Right.
Yeah, one small note here. I don't know if I entirely agree with his characterization of hierarchical relief being bureaucratic necessarily. Usually it was very informal. And I understand what he's trying to do there. He's probably going to make the connection that hierarchical relief is going to be the template for which the welfare state comes out of, just on a federal level instead of a voluntary. But bureaucratic kind of gets the wrong picture, especially considering the political landscape that a lot of these immigrants are entering, at least a few decades before they got there. Those political machines that you hear about in your history books, that end up being destroyed, if I remember correctly, with presidents like Chester A. Arthur. They are hierarchical relief organizations, just through a very political means. People would show up off the boat. If you registered for a party, you would be given a job and an income and all this other stuff. You would get help for your family and whatever else. That's hierarchical relief. There's zero bureaucracy involved in it, at least formally, because if there was, then if it was official, you would be got, basically, by some other part of the government. So there's less bureaucracy there than perhaps you might think reading this book necessarily, but just a little note there.
Yeah.
Sorry, Jennifer, just a question on that one. When these ethnic groups would come off the boat and these parties would go up to them and offer them, employment and benefits for joining a party, is this the reason that for the longest time, ethnic groups or different groups of people were strongly associated with particular types of politics?
Yes, typically the Democratic Party, if I remember correctly, because well, actually, no, I shouldn't say that. Whichever party had a stranglehold over that port that they went into was what group they would join. There were some outliers, so the 1848 Germans that came over into Texas or other places like that. It wasn't a political machine that got them to be the way they are. They were atheistic revolutionaries to begin with. You can find outliers, but by and large, that's why you will see these types will join basically much more paternalistic, more welfare-oriented groups, especially as time goes on and that becomes a possible state policy instead of just something under the table. So, yeah, just hopefully that explains that.
Yeah, and one of the big terms, right, Ryan, that we're seeing an emphasis on this from Aaron McIntyre as well as some other folks. You're describing a patronage system.
Right, that's exactly
they would
what
get
it
to
is.
the port and they'd get pulled right into a patronage system.
Right, and that's if you're wondering why on earth did the Democratic Party pivot towards we lost Mad Merc there. If you're wondering why did the Democratic Party pivot towards a pro or ambivalent policy towards Roman Catholicism in like the 1860s through 1900 or so, that's why. It's because most of their constituents that were showing up at the ports were Roman Catholic in some way, shape, or form. So it's a politicking there.
Right. Okay, so let's see, where were we? So we've got that distinction between hierarchical relief and reciprocal relief. Now, here's another distinction, what they called indoor relief and outdoor relief. I don't think we really use that terminology anymore. But indoor relief is you are going to live in this institution. You're going to be in an almshouse, an orphanage, an insane asylum, something like that. That's indoor relief. Okay. And then there was outdoor relief, which means that you're in your home and people are helping you in your home. So a running theme we're going to see through this chapter is stigma. I'll just highlight that word. Stigma was attached to dependence on outsiders. This aversion was most intense against indoor relief, right? That is, to actually be in an almshouse or something was to in a poorhouse, right? There was a lot of stigma around that. To have your relative, your cousin or your niece or your nephew end up in an orphanage, well, why aren't you taking care of them, right? Why isn't the larger family taking care of this child if the parents died?
Right.
This is a shame. This is a stigma around this to the people, to the family. Go ahead.
These sort of halfway houses also tend to be owned by socially progressive types as well, which is why you're, once again, since we like contrasting with mainstream history books, this is why those textbooks will focus on like Jane Addams' Whole House, which was basically an almshouse or a halfway house for people to or children and other I think young adults, if I remember correctly, would go there, be fed, housed, and they would try to like learn something. Housed by progressive types, obviously, and it has that stigma around it the old conservatives did not like. It was sort of like a moral failure on the part of the person or the family of the person who entered. So a lot of your history textbooks are still fighting this old battle by trying to really enshrine it as a great part of social progress. It's a very hidden dog whistle to people that don't really exist anymore, and this is why it's in there.
Right. Wow. So he says, in fact, there was such a stigma on this that few people took advantage of it. So in 1880, 1 in 758 Americans was in an almshouse, and the ratio actually widened to 1 in 920 by 1903. Right. So not a lot of people wanted to be doing this. Okay. Now, then there was outdoor relief. And yeah, I'm sorry, I'm talking about hierarchical relief in both these cases, the indoor version, the outdoor version. Now, the outdoor version of hierarchical relief would be like the charity society. And these were definitely part of the scene. Nearly all large, many small cities had versions of groups such as the Associated Charities of Boston and the Charity Organization Society of Buffalo. And these organizations relied on the services of volunteers who were often middle-class college women. Yeah, what does AWFL stand for, Ryan?
Was it affluent, white, liberal, female, or something like that?
Female liberal, maybe. Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah. Michael Malice is often picking on the awfuls because of their influence in politics, I guess. Okay, so the charity societies would get subsidies from state and local governments, but that actually diminished by 1900. So that about half of all cities over 200,000 had nearly eliminated public outdoor relief, including New York, Philadelphia, Baltimore, New Orleans, and San Francisco. So understand what happened here. Governments were more involved at a certain point in the late 1800s, and then they got less involved. And they weren't that involved, as we'll see. They were not that big a part of the picture of people getting help. But they got even less involved. Why? Well, listen to this. These cities were responding to complaints from social workers that aiding people in their homes fostered corruption, waste, and malingering. So this is the classic complaint about welfare, right? That we all are familiar with by now, that it has perverse incentives and it encourages idleness and the welfare trap, right? That they talk about, meaning, once you get in that mode where you're living off of contributions of some form, then it can get hard to just get back to work, here we are in the late 19th century, and they've already figured this out, and a bunch of the major American cities are backing off from it. So, wow, we learned that lesson, didn't we? Never did it again. Go ahead, Ryan.
It's the culture of dependency, and I remember my first introduction to the topic came from you can find it on YouTube now. It's the old television series of all people, Milton Friedman's Free to Choose had, I think, a whole segment dedicated to welfare and the sort of dependency that it creates. Not the strongest argument, I think, against the concept of state welfare, but certainly one that is persisting, as we can see by this book. It's I think he might have had Thomas Sowell on for that one as well for the panel that they discuss afterwards. But
Mhm.
it's a perennial conservative critique of welfare that has existed, as you can see here, ever since like subsidiarity was trying to be practiced on the more state and city level, then obviously backed off for a observable reason, which is that it creates this culture.
Yeah, it has bad results. Yeah, and I don't mind bringing it
It,
up, Ryan. I mean, like you said, there's other things that can be said, but for well-meaning people, uh, I'm thinking about my daughter studying the projects, uh, Sykes Pico or whatever it was that she was writing a paper on, um, and she's like, "Wow, so this welfare stuff, it was like causing families to be broken up and it's having all these bad effects." So, in other words, there's this, for some reason, some people have this intuitive notion that, hey, you hand people money and it helps them. Well, this gives you reason to start having second thoughts about that, right? Maybe it's not
mm.
so simple.
One of the things I'd like to just point out here very quickly is it's quite amazing that the institutions of the time had the uh, ability to back away from public welfare.
Yeah.
A lot of the time, we think of the government today, that very famous Milton Friedman quote, "There's nothing more permanent than a temporary government program."
Hmm.
And I'd just like to note that, politically they were able to step away from giving public welfare, if only for a short amount of time. So
Yeah.
it's a reflection on the political system that they had at the time.
I think it also has to do with, we're talking about state and local, right, Ryan? Because it seems like at the federal level, rather than canceling anything, they just print more money, or what, they play various games. State and local governments, I've noticed, have a habit of going, we just can't afford to do that anymore. We have to stop.
Yeah, your state or city does not have access to the Federal Reserve like certain people in the federal government do, so they can't just
Right.
call up Washington or St. Louis or someone like that and say, "Hey, can you provide more funds here?"
Right.
You actually do have that sort of classical conception of, can we afford this? Can we not afford this? No, well, I guess we can't do it.
Yeah. Yeah, I know. It's sort of shocking to see it. Okay, well, let's pick it up here. So, yeah, here he emphasizes this point. So I know we're talking a little bit about government getting involved, but don't be thrown. He says by 1901, the annual amount of government subsidies topped $10 million to orphanages and so forth. Even so, the combined federal, state, and local involvement in social welfare was Lilliputian by current standards, less than 1% of the gross national product. So, what, Ryan, you don't know off the top of your head, what roughly is the um, percentage of the federal budget that goes to welfare,
I
social security, et cetera, et cetera? You know,
Actually, I think the
huge.
last time I checked, it was like 62 or 63% if you count Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and all the
All
other
that
sort of.
stuff. Right.
Because I remember that was one of the things I used to argue about was military spending and all this other stuff. And you had the false dichotomy of more or less, and typically if you're saying we need less, then it's because we needed it takes up too much a proportion of the budget. While
Mhm.
I, being the edgy third position guy in my middle school or high school, I would come in by saying, well, actually, welfare takes up a way larger proportion of the budget, and maybe it should all just be lowered across the board.
Yeah.
Sort of as like the libertarian break the dichotomy sort of thing. But yeah, if I
Right.
remember correctly, it was in excess of 60% towards welfare
And and
initiatives.
I had gathered that it has tended to be growing over time. The proportion that goes to
Correct.
welfare spending, right? It's tended to be getting bigger because they've made promises to everybody, and there's the boomer generation that is still among us, absorbing funds. But anyway, um, okay, right. So he covered the hierarchical relief and government relief briefly, but the main focus here is going to be reciprocal relief, because reciprocal relief was far more prevalent than either governmental or private hierarchical relief. That is, if you think of the great wealthy. Why are all the names leaving my mind? The wealthy guys in the 19th century, right?
The robber barons, the captains of industry might be a little bit better of a term.
I was thinking of their names though.
Carnegie, Rockefeller.
Yeah, thank you,
Marlin.
Carnegie, Rockefeller. So yes, they were doing various things, right? The government was doing various things, but that was not the main story back then. The main story was reciprocal relief, and its most basic expression was informal giving. Countless and unrecorded acts of kindness from neighbors, fellow employees, relatives, friends. He says, we don't have stats on this, right? Because it was informal, it wasn't written down. But they did a study in 1905 of 200 wage-earning families in New York City, and that revealed that almost every family of small income received some help or other from friends or relatives in the form of clothing for the children, money for the rent, occasional gifts to carry the family over a tight place. And so out of those 200 families, it says there were over 60 instances discovered of this fraternal helpfulness. So this is just a regular part of life, that you help your family, you help your friends, you help your neighbors, right? And I like this. Informal giving aided so many that it was fallacious to classify families into distinct categories such as dependent or independent. And by the way, this is Ryan, something I haven't emphasized that much, but many decades ago, it occurred to me that people had really misunderstood the libertarian tradition or whatever, classical liberal libertarian tradition, because it gets called individualistic. But to me, it was quite clear studying it that it was about interdependence. That was really the through line that you see over and over again is mutual dependence, interdependence.
Quite clearly, and that's you can even see this on some of the more mainstream type of libertarians. Whenever they do get pressed on the topic of welfare, they get asked, well, what are you going to replace it with? And then suddenly the individualism act drops if they're the kind of mainstreamer that would take it, and they start saying, well, you just ask for help from the people around you like a community. So there is dissonance there in the mainstreamers even, but you can. This is kind of where libertarians especially do a better job at articulating a major thing that we had in our traditional culture that has been lost in modernity. You'll see I remember in cartoons or things like that, there would always be a trope that would sometimes get referenced maybe in an episode or two throughout an entire run of something. And it would always be like going over to ask your neighbor for like a cup of sugar or something. I haven't done that in my entire life. I haven't seen any of my family members do that in my entire life, but my grandparents and great-grandparents will tell me about doing that at points in their life. Yep. That's a sort of interdependence. You are literally just asking for a gift from somebody else nearby, someone that you would have a closer relationship to for that reason. Yep. And they would just give you something like a cup of sugar. It's a sort of interdependence that has been dissolved and people have been further atomized. Ironically, as the state power and our various different appendages of social media propped up by the state have sort of done away with those things.
Yeah, no, I remember a neighbor coming to get a cup of sugar from us and us getting a cup of sugar from our neighbor when I was a kid. So yeah, but of course I'm like a different generation than you, right? And Mad Mark.
Yeah, I actually have had an instance where someone has asked for aid from the local community, and happy to give it, but it is definitely not as common as it used to be. And on the point of atomization and modern times, in the past it was very easy to ask for that aid because you knew your neighbors, you went to church with them, you were of the same background, you were of the same stock as them. So you had many layers and many levels. You were connected. You had a shared history, and that with atomization, with the influx of different belief systems and different backgrounds, and it separates, it atomizes us. And without that mutual aid, this state has stepped into that role. And I think we can all agree that probably is doing a less of a quality job of providing that aid.
Right. Yeah, no, you make a great point. Diversity, there's studies on this. I'm not saying anything I can't back up. Uh, Diverse communities have less mutual aid. It's just the truth. And we'll see this here that it's really within homogenous communities, smaller homogenous communities, immigrant communities, and so forth, that you really see the mutual aid happening. Okay, so coming back to this theme of the monetary, not just the monetary thing, but one of the things you would see is other sorts of help, like job information, meaning, hey, I heard there's an opening. I think you should apply for it, right? Homes for orphans, barn raisings, temporary housing. These were all things that were happening with this voluntary, spontaneous, reciprocal relief within communities, right? And so he says the self-help and informal neighborly arrangements created by the poor themselves dwarf the efforts of formal social welfare agencies. A prominent social worker was writing about this, and he said, if there were no resources in times of exceptional distress except the provision which people would voluntarily make on their own account, and the informal neighborly help which people would give to one another, most of the misfortunes would still be provided for. So helping each other, he said, really is all a community needs. It doesn't need outsiders coming in, you know. And then what was this other thing? Yeah, in another study in 1899, he said he had been unable to tally the vast amount of individual private charity and relief dispensed through Masonic lodges and mutual benefit societies. And so now we come to fraternal societies. And he says they had features of hierarchical relief, but the best way to think about them is institutions of reciprocal relief. That is, within a fraternal society, you have people who are helping each other as in that peer mode. And to use that great phrase again, where was it? That today's recipient could be tomorrow's donor, right? That's really more the mode that these fraternal societies were all about. Okay, going to skip forward a bit. He does a lot of stuff where he breaks it, and if you have interest, the details are here, but he breaks it down by, here's what the Japanese immigrants are doing, the Chinese immigrants, and here's what the blacks are doing. And there are certain key details that jumped out at me, but I wasn't going to try to make this like an ethnic study this time, just because there's too much detail there. But here's a table that's interesting. This is 1909, lodge membership among wage earners in New York City by income. And the lowest family income they record, $600 to $699, which is really bad, is my understanding. In 1999, that was pretty bad. That's the annual income, by the way. So even inflation adjusted, it's not much.
It's $20K.
$20K by today's standards. Thank you. Yeah. So for the year, that's not much money. And even so, 36% of them were paying into a lodge, right? And then it goes up as the income goes up. Okay, so let's see. Yeah, and then something jumped out. We'll see more of this later. The welfare state particularly kicked in with the Great Society programs with American blacks, as we covered in a previous episode. In fact, sorry, that reminds me, I had meant to share, Ryan and I did a trilogy on the history of Black Americans, and the second part of it was called Forgotten Freedom.
Wasn't Mr. Mercenary there with us as well for that episode?
Oh, was he? I'm looking at the screen. I only see you and me.
Oh, okay.
For this one, it's just for that particular episode. It was just you and me.
Yeah.
And we draw from this very book in that episode in sort of telling the story of that 100 years between the end of the war between the states and the Great Society programs, where Black Americans actually did quite well and nobody wants to talk about it. Everybody has their reasons, but like no one talks about that except Thomas Sowell, of course.
There's another reason that especially conservatives won't address another half of the story, and that most of these associations were very specifically, you have to be black to do this. This is like the black fund for these specific black families in this locality.
Yep.
The Civil Rights Acts do not allow that to happen. That is discriminatory based off of race. So a lot of your mainstream conservatives, when they talk about the Great Society, they will say that this is the sole reason why, just for instance, the black families or the poor whites or whatever else are in the state of poverty that they are today. They're missing out on this other half of the picture, that the Civil Rights Acts really abolished this very discriminatory structure that we have set up here in the mutual aid societies. They are very discriminatory, but everyone would find their the place that they could fit into. You can't have that afterwards.
They had one minor benefit. They worked. Except for that, they were terrible, and it's so good that we're free of them now.
And for any person who's randomly come across this stream, we're not using discriminatory in a bad sense here. Local people of the same background supporting other local people who they know and trust is a good thing. Yeah. This is a good thing.
Yeah, it's a huge
localism is a good thing.
We talk a lot in economics about coordination, how to coordinate, right? The challenges of coordinating together. And one of the big issues is trust. And one of the ways that you solve this problem, this coordination problem, is that you find people that you trust because you are fellow Christians, or you share an ethnicity, or you're family members, we're cousins, whatever. There's a million ways to solve the problem, right? But it comes down to finding something that reduces that question mark of, should I really trust this person? Should we go in together on, a fund to help each other when times are hard? Will the other guy just plunder it, right? Those kinds of trust problems can get solved through this sort of thing. Clossington says blacks had Prince Hall Freemasonry, which is covered in chapter 1 of this book, and we talked about it in the video I shared. He says, my lodge was still segregated until the late 90s. Clossington is black, it turns out. Member of the Prince Hall. Anyway, confusing share there, but I think I follow you. Anyway, the reason that's funny is if you ever saw Clossington. Anyway, never mind. Okay. Outside of the immigrant groups, Negroes represent the only class of population where the habit of mutual insurance through voluntary association has developed to the highest degree in the United States. He wrote back in like 1909, something like that. So not only were Black Americans involved with these sorts of mutual aid societies, they tended to be even stronger in their participation than like the immigrant groups, for example. Okay, so let's see. We kind of already talked about the economic aspect. There's breakdowns here by ethnicity. Look at the Austrians, 66% membership. And then it doesn't show the Slavs. Oh, yeah, here we go. The Russians, 76%. Probably Russian. That probably means Jewish. Russian Jews in particular.
A little bit of reading in between the lines there.
Yeah, well, he says that in the text, I believe.
Right, and then the Bohemians as well have a 71%. So you see a lot of these people coming out of Central Europe, in particular the Austrian Empire at the time, just the Austrian Empire at the time, did have these very strong bonds that they would share with each other. And this is interesting because Bohemians and Austrians had made their way to the United States long before the 1890s. So it's not like this is not like a new group and they have absolutely no one's ever heard of an Austrian or a Bohemian before. I'm sure the vast majority hadn't, but that's just due to the you don't have to teach geography in 1909 to everyone, much like you don't have to today. But this is it's not just like a sort of 1890s immigrant rush phenomenon of this communal bonds, membership, and all this other stuff. So any nativists out there that might be worried about the subversive nature of all this, you do have some familiar groups actually practicing this in high numbers.
So in this study that we're looking at this table, he says ethnicity was more important than income in determining fraternal affiliation. So even poor people, if they were Russian or Bohemian, tended to be part of these things, right? And again, mentioning on the lower income, fraternal affiliation in Chicago reached down to the very poor. The commission estimated that 32.6% in the lowest income group carried life or funeral benefits in fraternal societies. Point of emphasizing this is just to say this was ubiquitous. It wasn't just something that the very rich did or something like that, or the professional class. This was the working class, working poor, everybody. Okay, another table. There Jewish is broken out in that particular study in 1919. Okay, this caught my attention. He mentions a place where there were mill workers, and their need for protection against physical risks was made the popularity of lodges particularly strong because of the constant peril of accident or death in their work. So there you go. But he also says the social features of the lodge had drawing power. The immigrants had kind of ethnic isolation. They didn't have a lot of social amenities such as theaters and parks. Maybe they couldn't afford them. Maybe they weren't allowed in them. I don't know. And the lodges would be a place where you could go. And this is a great time to share. Clossington should probably be on the stream. But anyway, he's helping from the sidelines. He says, oh, shoot, where was it? I was just looking at it. There we go. Americans went to church every Sunday and went to the lodge every Wednesday.
So, right,
Yeah.
and I was going to make the point here. There was a notable portion of the population that was against the more esoteric fraternal structure. Like, I'm sure what Clossington's referring to there is the WASPs would go to a sort of Freemasonic lodge or something similar. Other religions would not allow that. So the Roman Catholics would have.
They wouldn't allow
fraternal...
Freemasonry, but
well,
they would
Freemasonry
have other
and
things like this.
A lot of the other things that have been name dropped so far have been, banned or discouraged due to a more esoteric nature behind it that didn't sit well with the religious authorities. And we're about to get into the section on life insurance, which was, in some churches, just banned entirely due to the nature of insurance, necessarily. So what you would have for these groups is that the lodge would just be the congregation. So even the people that did not necessarily fall into what's being described here did have some form of a mutual, not necessarily hierarchical aid going on. It was just in the congregation, which is mentioned in the book a couple of times, just not as emphasized as the lodges and other forms of society.
Clossington's just throwing all kinds of great stuff out. My lodge donated $10,000 4 months ago to a widow whose husband died in the line of duty. So yeah, this is not gone. It's great to hear. Okay, so now getting into life insurance. Studies during the period repeatedly point to the pervasiveness of life insurance ownership among the working class. 81.9% of wage-earning families in Chicago had at least one member with a life insurance policy, for example. In Chicago and Homestead, 9 in 10 Black families carried some life insurance, more than any other group, including Native whites, non-immigrant whites, right? In Philadelphia, a study of Black migrant families in 1917, so the migrant meaning they've come north, right, to Philadelphia, showed that 98% of them had life insurance policies. Okay, this is in 1917. So, this is kind of a weird phrase, but social technology, right? From a social technology point of view, have we advanced since 100 years ago, or have we gone backwards, right?
Development might be a better word.
Yeah. Social development. Yeah, something like that. Yeah, go ahead, Medmer.
Well, most clearly, it's degraded over time, and I think in future we'll get into why and how these institutions went into their downfall.
Right. The rest of the book, teaser or foreshadowing, tells you how all this fell apart or was made to fall apart, more likely. Okay, so yeah, let's see what else. So this is interesting. There are still signs now of what this fraternal insurance was back then, because two of the three largest companies in the field of life insurance, Prudential and Metropolitan Life, came out of fraternal organizations. They just, they were part of a fraternal thing, and then eventually they became their own company. And in at least one case later in the chapter, it mentions like legally they had to make it a separate organization or whatever. And then as fraternalism died, the life insurance company just kept on being a life insurance company. But anyway, the point is, these are reminders for those who have the background that, you see Prudential, you see Metropolitan Life. This should remind us now, oh yeah, that came from this era of fraternalism, of mutual aid. Prudential was originally chartered as a friendly society, while Metropolitan Life initially relied on the Hildesbund, a German mutual aid association, to collect its premiums. So they both came out of, community mutual aid organizations.
Right. I did mention earlier, it seemed to kind of shock you, there were churches that banned, insurance, life insurance in particular. And the LCMS, very old church, was one of these. So the German Lutherans largely did not buy into these. The German Lutherans in particular. The Scandinavian Lutherans, I'm sure, did whatever they wanted to, because that seems to be their MO. But they viewed it as a sort of defiance of providence and and an explicit mistrust in the actions of God. So they would prohibit life insurance, property insurance, and all this other stuff, and they would just basically pool money as a congregation or draw from anyone if they needed to. So it was insurance in particular that they did not like, and the sort of actuarial sort of trying to calculate what's the odds that God might strike you down or something along that line.
Gotcha.
But these Lutherans were not the only ones to do it. There were other churches that also had a similar prohibition. And it was because people actually cared about what their church said, that they weren't kind of like where we are today, where the churches may or may not be subverted, soft, out of touch, all these other things, and people actually had a undying faith in a religion. These pronouncements from the church did actually mean something.
Right. Okay, so let's see what else to highlight here. Okay, yeah, I'm not sure. Okay, yeah, so back to this, the stigma, the dread of dependence, he calls it here. For many poor people, sharing the risk, whether through fraternal or commercial insurance, was an essential precaution against the stigma of charity and the poorhouse. Louise Bollard Moore concluded that insurance fosters a pride which is to a certain degree creditable, a spirit of independence, and a commendable horror of pauperism. So the idea is, hey, I was a faithful member of our community, of our fraternal order, whatever, our mutual aid arrangement, whatever it is, our church. I paid into it faithfully, and then I fell on hard times. And so getting help from that, as I helped others when they needed help, me drawing help, it doesn't have stigma. It doesn't have shame around it, right? It's me participating in my community. I help them, they help me. Right? That interdependence doesn't have that stigma attached to it that dependence does. The dread of charity is how one person put it, was almost universal among the poor. Let's just pause for a moment and savor that. The dread of charity was almost universal among the poor. Try to imagine that. And worth noting that we're making a statement there about a level of poverty that essentially, like in today's United States, no one is at that level of poverty. No one's that poor anymore. Our poor are obese, right? I don't think the poor in 1919 were fat. That's just a guess. But I didn't do research. Don't have the stats, but that's just a guess. Okay, so for example, they said every Pole these are Polish, at least one of the authors Polish, every Pole who accepts the help of American institutions is considered not only disgraced personally as a pauper, but as disgracing the whole Polish colony. So you're bringing shame on all of us, right? Like we can't take care of ourselves. We don't take care of each other. We're lazy or something. We don't want that reputation, right? We want to have respect.
Again, we hear from this chapter the strong communal bonds.
Yeah.
one of us is down, we are all down.
Right.
This sort of mentality is very clearly articulated here.
Very good. With the Italians as well. In America, as in Italy, Italians are no more willing to commit feeble-minded dependents to institutions than they are the aged. In other words, if someone has special needs or whatever, we take care of them. They're our own, right? We don't send the old people off to an old person home, and so on and so forth. Black communities as well. There was a relative absence of what might be called a psychology of dependence. I'm going through these details carefully because given where we are now, given the reputation that poor Black Americans have in regards to welfare, sort of what the Great Society has done, you might think I'm like making this up. So I'm trying to really quote chapter and verse to explain that it wasn't always this way. Something changed, right? And we'll see that later on in the book. Blacks in Washington, D.C. were not generally wards of the state. Rather than being indolent welfare cheaters, they took responsibility for their own lives, demonstrating pride, independence, and strength. It's amazing to read this. Seldom does one find a Negro begging on the streets. Black leaders peppered their speeches with versions of Booker T. Washington's famous boast that since Reconstruction, Blacks had not asked, quote, the national government to appropriate a single dollar to be used in providing us as a race shelter, clothes, or food. So not only this one guy, Booker T. Washington, but many Black leaders at the time took pride in saying, we don't go to the government for handouts. I am talking about the United States that I live in right now, a mere 100 years ago. Ryan.
And yeah, so there is a shock factor there, and I think we might have covered this in our original series, but you do see kind of like a dichotomy there into who the Blacks are going to look to for leadership during this era of Booker T. Washington. So the book's quoting this in hindsight, so it's not the era of the book, it's the era of Washington himself. It's are they going to go with him where he's sort of advocating a parallel society, building more self-sufficient, almost commercial nature for these Black communities? Or do they go the route of W.E.B. Du Bois, where they're talking about not necessarily parallel societies, but rather just full racial separatism, sort of like race communism and all this other stuff. Du Bois himself was a member of the Communist Party, which makes it all the stranger when modern conservatives cite him as some sort of major great figure to look to. But the vast majority of their intellectual leaders did not go Booker T. Washington's route, which is why you see this sort of thing where people in the modern day have heard of W.E.B. Du Bois or Du Bois. Booker T. Washington, however, has fallen very hard by the wayside. I think Thomas Sowell might have been the last major public intellectual to really rely on anything that Booker T. Washington came up with.
Right. Yep. Yeah, and just to be clear, you're talking about something that shifted in the 20th century. Early in the 20th century, Booker T. Washington, that kind of mentality, as we're seeing, is normal. That's the standard. Later second half of the 20th century, the Great Society era and so forth, he falls out of favor and they go towards communism, basically.
Closer to the New Deal, but yeah, because that's when their academic structures start to develop. It's closer to the 30s and 40s. This New Deal sort of focus on academia starts to favor the more communistic side of things rather than Booker T. Washington's more conservative or liberal parallelism side of things.
Right. We get Mad Merc for 1 hour a week. We're at the close of that hour for this week. Thank you, sir, for joining us. It's so great to have you back regularly again.
It is a pleasure to be back on the show. Have a good evening or morning to everyone who was watching. Goodbye.
All right. Thanks, sir. Okay. A big motivation for taking out insurance was to avoid the humiliation of a pauper's grave. So funeral insurance was a big deal in these mutual societies. So one of the things that a fellow was studying, Asa Martin, that's a man's name, right? Martin was taken aback by how many blacks who lived in abject poverty yet regularly paid weekly premiums. He encountered an especially memorable case of a man who resided in a saloon basement, a place unfit for human habitation. Martin observed with more than a hint of sarcasm that his future was well provided for. He belonged to 3 fraternal orders and carried 2 insurance policies, all of which guaranteed him a $275 burial, concerning which he spoke with much pride. So between 1871 and 1918, the rate of pauper burials per 100,000 actually fell from 185 to 86. So this was a big concern for people, that they have a proper burial, and they were taking care of it through mutual aid. Okay, so back to the values part of this. It wasn't just about the money. I mean, that's a central part of it, right? Is helping each other materially, but it's more than that. By joining a lodge, an initiate adopted, at least implicitly, a set of values. Societies dedicated themselves to the advancement of mutualism, mutual aid, self-reliance, business training, thrift, leadership skills, self-government, self-control, and good moral character. These values reflected a fraternal consensus that cut across such seemingly intractable divisions as race, gender, and income. Yeah, and I think it's fair that I'm portraying this as an age of mutual aid, sort of regardless of other distinctions, class distinctions and race distinctions and stuff, because everybody was doing this mutual aid, and or it was very common, normal, and it had all of this focus on thrift and all these various qualities. This was just a normal thing to be part of these things and to have that value system. So talking about the Security Benefit Association, for example, this was a statement from one of the members. Its prime object of the SBA is to promote the brotherhood of man, teach fidelity to home and loved ones, loyalty to country, and respect of law, to establish a system for the care of the widows and orphans, the aged and disabled, and enable every worthy member to protect himself from the ills of life, and make substantial provision through cooperation with our members for those who are nearest and dearest, right? More value stuff. The mystic words of our order from the SBA are wisdom, protection, security, fraternity, but the greatest of these is fraternity. Now, I don't want to go on too much of a rabbit hole, Ryan, but some people might hear fraternity and think of fraternité from the French Revolution. But I kind of get the feeling that the fraternity that we're talking about with these mutual aid guys is not the same thing that the French Revolution was up to.
So it does depend on the organization, because when you're talking about the French Revolution, of course, it's national brotherhood, a sort of egalitarianism that can exist within a nation. I don't want to call it civic necessarily, because there would have been disagreement there, but it was a way of egalitarianism. Some or a lot of these lodges, depending on who you ask, are going to tend towards that more subversive edge, which is why you'll see a lot of women's movements happening around this point in time. Fits in perfectly with the first wave of feminism. They will also have their own lodges, their own organizations for which they help each other, fund their protests and all this other stuff. So it's not all necessarily good. It's not all necessarily bad either. It's just a separate category. People belong to a lodge. Whether the lodge was good or bad, it depends on the character of the people in it.
The Junior Order of Moose, part of the Moose lodges, did its bit with the slogan, "Be good, do good, make good." I thought that was nice. And then this was a song, "Blessed be the tie that binds," in their rituals, or a poem or whatever. "Blessed be the tie that binds us in fraternal love. The fellowship of kindred minds is like to that above." The ritual of another group proclaimed, "Stand back, grim poverty, we protect the child." So there's this theme of a loving and extended family that taught you values, took care of you if you fell on hard times, right? There's a big emphasis on self-reliance. Well, what does that mean? How can we be talking about mutual aid and self-reliance at the same time? Well, the incentives in these societies were such that they didn't encourage dependency in the way that our welfare state does, as we'll get to later, right? There was pressure. These were people who knew you. There was pressure to not be lazy, right? Because if you were just trying to abuse the benefits of the mutual aid society, the other people would know it, because it tended to be local knowledge, right? And they'd be like, hey, he doesn't deserve help from us. He's just kicking his feet up and trying to grift, trying to just live off of us. Go ahead, Ryan.
Yeah, think back to the asking your neighbors for a cup of sugar example. Very basic thing to illustrate the principles here of a mutual aid society, or at least a communal society. A society with community. If you keep asking your neighbor daily for a cup of sugar, they're going to eventually tell you, no, you need to get your own sugar. They're not going to just fund it for yourself. If you ask them once every so often, when you actually need it, something's gone wrong, you forgot something, you need something, at this one instant, then most good neighbors will lend it to you just as you would to them. So in the same way that someone coming up to your door daily asking for a cup of sugar, you would eventually tell them no. So too would your neighbors. So too would these societies if you just leached off of them.
Right. Trivia from Clossington. Liberty, equality, fraternity was the slogan of Paris's Nine Muses Masonic Lodge. There you go. There's the subversion.
I was trying to avoid bringing that up. If you want to get into some weird stuff, I've been told the Mexican Freemasonic orders get very insane.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. Well, let's stick to the positive for now. Now, this is interesting. Remember earlier I had talked about individualism being a misunderstanding of sort of the classical liberal or libertarian emphasis, which really had more to do with voluntary interdependence, in my view. He says here in the book, if self-reliance and thrift were fraternal watchwords, so too was individualism. Now, individualism is a big naughty word among right-wingers and so forth. So let's be careful about what they mean when they use that term here, right? He says it did not entail Epicurean self-gratification or Emersonian contrariness. Instead, it was akin to a winnowing out process for the improvement of character. So successful fraternal individualists were to be economically self-reliant as well as proficient in the arts of cooperation and leadership. So, and then here it says an official of, I'm not going to go through all the names of the groups, but an official of one of these groups rejected any contradiction between opposition to selfish individualism, intemperance, and non-accumulativeness, and support for a program to enable people to get homes and means upon which they may independently subsist. So I think it's just another term for self-reliance, in short, in this context. It isn't a desire for atomistic individualism. It's a desire for people to, if you're helping someone, the goal is not to turn them into dependents. The goal is to turn them into self-reliant people. Yes, they have a little trouble right now. You help them through it. Maybe you teach them skills. Maybe you help them find a job. Now they're standing on their own. Now they're in a position to help others, right? So in other words, the goal is to have as many people standing on their own 2 feet as possible, right? Individualism. But understand very carefully what they mean by the term. It isn't the naughty, the scare word that individualism is often used as these days. Atomistic individualism, I guess, is what we get at when we usually use that term. So a key tenet of fraternal individualism was the need to exercise mastery over the self. So individualism as self-control. Here's quoting from the Loyal Order of Moose. The kingship of self-control was the noblest royalty of a man. The self-control he is taught to observe is the highest and best use of all his faculties, the mastery of his desires, passions, and appetites, and the power to withstand temptation to the illegitimate use or prostitution of any part of his being, body, mind, spirit, and will. Self-control meant the power to resist such vices as gluttony, over-drinking, over-smoking, lack of exercise, bad air, bad conversation, fool books. I really like that, Ryan. Fool books. We got to remember that one. I should pull it out on somebody on Twitter. James Lindsay, you and your fool books. Anyway. So, what are they talking about here when they use individualism? It seems like you should have good character. You should have virtue. We should encourage virtues and not vices. You should be self-supporting. You should support your family. You shouldn't be a layabout. You shouldn't be looking to everybody else to take care of you all the time, right? someone who's responsible, someone who exercises self-control, and then just something bad happens to them, right? They get sick through no fault of their own. There's an accident at work. We want to come and help you, right? But we want to encourage virtue and we want to discourage vice as part of these societies, right? This is interesting. Vigilant watch was maintained against those who endangered the harmony of the lodge by indulging in personal attacks. One can only imagine bringing these people, Ryan, to 100 year, from 100 years in the past, and giving them a little time to watch Twitter. They'd be like, ah.
As I'll say, after we read this paragraph, we can basically give a selling point for the Old Glory Club, because this is one of the first things that we talked about as a rule. But before we get there, we might as well say what we're talking about. We have a very funny quote here in the next sentence of the paragraph.
She says, the ladies of the moose. She says, the woman with a grievance is welcome nowhere. And they required that an initiate forswear slandering a member of this order or a family of a member. Right?
Right, and that's whenever we were forming the Old Glory Club and we were actually talking about what should the requirements and rules be besides what we just promote, what is an actual rule. One of the first things that we absolutely banned was, slandering or attacking or basically defaming a fellow member of the Old Glory Club, just because that's a part of what we're trying to prevent is this sort of right-wing spurge strategy of just attack everyone that you see and hopefully something good comes out of it. This was a natural part of living in a community once upon a time that everyone has since lost, it seems, especially if you listen to just like workplace gossip, church gossip, or anything else. This is not a rule that really exists anymore. Fraternal societies actually played a role in this, and so did church societies. Everything we've been talking about throughout the stream so far. You would lose quite a lot of your security, quite a lot of your communal support if you just slandered people for the sake of doing it. Obviously, speaking the truth about something, especially as it pertains to an issue at hand, that's a perfectly fine thing. It's not slandering. Picking fights with people just to pick fights with them or to make a point or demonstrate some sort of social ego match or whatever, that's not allowed, and you would incur actual consequences, not something that exists today due to the atomization that we live in.
Right, exactly. Nonpartisanship was a component of the fraternal value consensus. So they typically were, the organization was designated as non-sectarian or non-political, with a unfortunate exception, as we'll learn soon. The Loyal Order of Moose, to give an example, was not unique when it signed up prominent politicians from both parties, William Jennings Bryan, Theodore Roosevelt, and Champ Clark. So they would all be in the same fraternal order together, even though they were in different political parties, because fraternal orders were not that kind of thing. They were sort of off to, they were in a different part of life, I guess you could say, in the same way that Christians would go to church together and not necessarily vote the same way in the presidential election or something, and you wouldn't think that was weird. And so there's patriotism. I'm going to skip forward a bit. Okay. I said the Lady of the Moose. That's not right. It's the Ladies of the Maccabees. It was a biblical reference to the Maccabees. That was founded in 1892. And this is maybe a little more subversive here. They got involved in politics. They did not consider, I guess you could say, women's rights type issues to be political. And so many of the leaders of these women's organizations, because they called themselves fraternal, by the way, even though they were sororal, is actually the technical term. They played prominent roles in suffrage and temperance organizations. Go ahead, Ryan.
We did skip a paragraph that I thought was interesting because it kind of goes into the immediate traditional defense against socialism and communism. How do you combat this new ideology that's popping up? Well, you make sure that people don't really care about class, and that's one of the things that these fraternities did. We skipped over that paragraph right after talking about the politicians. This is actually a very important sort of a bulwark, if you will, against a rising socialist movements throughout the world. This is also, you could probably read into this, I'm sure, if someone needed like a dissertation paper topic, this could probably be one. I would be willing to bet that a lot of these fraternities as the book mentions here, they prohibit formal distinctions based off of income and class, and I'm sure there would be something natural that arises, but not necessarily primary or even tertiary, really. Class and income does not matter if you're just helping each other out. If you're in sort of a fraternal society based off of a common interest, based off of a common goal or something like that, you don't really care about who's in the wealthy upper class and who's the poor masses surrounding them in this fraternity. No one would think like that. It's a
Right.
great way to make sure that we don't fall into this Bismarckian welfare state to give the socialists what they want so that we don't become socialist kind of idea that the German conservatives fell into. Because we didn't, a lot of our society, as we see here, were tied up in these organizations that prevented, at least formally, sort of this class consciousness that socialism, communism, and various other forms of Marxism relied upon.
Right. Very good. Yeah. So one of the groups says they boasted that they make capital and labor friends, which if they're talking that way, they must be feeling the heat from the socialist stuff, right?
Right.
And they're responding directly to that.
Now, to sort of critique what I just said, this was the sort of like the grounds of which the English Liberal Party ran on until it basically dissolved. It did not do too well, but then again, that was Britain. They did not fare so well in the face of the new ideology of Marxism. Maybe it was successful. Maybe that's why we don't really have a history of people trying to combine capital and labor. Maybe it's because they succeeded, and now it's just sort of like a way that American society functioned. I don't really know, but it would be interesting to see if these fraternities actually contributed to warding off these sort of more militant, more communistic labor movements.
Yeah. Yeah. No, it makes a lot of sense. It certainly fits with what he's telling us, which is that these are cross-cutting, right? Cross-cutting and cross-class. You might be of the same religion or the same ethnicity, right? But class was not the distinction that was made for these things. So let's see. I was going to mostly skip over this, not trying to cover every last bit. What he does now is he goes through 3 of the organizations where he's focused more on like women and blacks type of stuff. But there are a few things that jumped out to me. I thought this was interesting, not so much because of the focus on women, but just the way that one of the cornerstones of fraternalism was training in self-government. Well, what does that mean? In this case, she says, this one lady says, this policy was great because it enabled a woman to associate with her kind in other ways than social pastimes. It teaches her many things that man has arrogated to himself: the business conduct of a meeting, parliamentary law, many details of money expenditures. So if you abstract away a bit from the fact that it's, women learning how to organize, whatever you think of that, the issue of organization, as Academic Agent has really brought home with his previous book, is really key, right? It is important to learn how to organize. It is perhaps of paramount importance in the world of politics. He who organizes wins is sort of a quick way to put it. So if by being involved in fraternal organizations, not only or mutual aid, not only do we help each other out, not only do we maybe reduce bickering, right, with the rule that Ryan mentioned, but we also just get experience at organizing something, right? That is valuable in and of itself. And we're able to take those skills and bring them into effect in other ways. So I thought that was quite interesting to call out. I'm going to skip over some of this. Most of them were housewives back then, of course.
Right, and the thing that you mentioned there that was common in most fraternal societies. One of the reasons perhaps that this is mentioned here with the women's group in particular is because this was something that a lot of the social progressives would focus on at the start of the last century, was trying to educate women sort of as a sort of like a revitalization of a concept called Republican motherhood, which was another proto-feministic movement early on in the colonies, at the very least. Make sure that your women are educated, they can stay independent from men if they want to or need to or something like that. And then, they can go on to organize more women to secure greater rights for women, emancipation, all this other stuff. So in this one group of women here that he singled out for probably that reason, that it was a trend going on with the progressives. It is subversive. In the other fraternal societies, it's probably for less nefarious reasons on a civilizational scale.
Let's see, I'm jumping around a bit. United Order of True Reformers. This was a, let's see, a semi-official black affiliate of the all-white Independent Order of Good Templars. And let's see, yeah, they got going because of a fellow named William Washington Brown, and he shifted the organization's focus to practical concerns. It had been a little too ideological before, I guess. They became the first society to provide life insurance benefits above the cost of a funeral. Their membership really surged, went across many states. This is interesting because history is always complex, right, Ryan? Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, despite their other differences, both praised this organization as an exemplar of Black self-help and creativity. So that's interesting. And so they actually started business enterprises. That's one of the reasons I wanted to slow down and focus on this. The True Reformers Savings Bank of Richmond, Virginia. That was their main organization. Founded in 1889, had $500,000 in assets by 1907. They established a 150-room hotel, a newspaper, retail stores, an old age home, and looks like they were trying to make something called Brownsville. I don't know Virginia well enough to know if they succeeded. In this particular case, Brown, the key figure here, similar to Booker T. Washington, but a little bit more of a radical edge, he said he declared a war of independence against white financial control. So he has an emphasis on like exclusively, shop at black businesses, that kind of thing, right? So you could call it a segregationist interest. You could just call it, supporting your community type thing. So I think that's quite interesting. Let's see. Then Independent Order of St. Luke. I'm just about to wrap this up here. Didn't want to get into too many details. Yeah, I think that's all I wanted to focus on. Okay, then just from the conclusion of the chapter, although insurance gave some protection, individuals who subscribed to fraternal societies gained access to services not easily guaranteed in a commercial contract. The lodge offered its members the formal and informal components of mutual aid and sought to educate them in a set of values. All of these societies drew from the same basic fraternal pantheon of self-help, individualism, it seems to mean like self-improvement, I think, self-government, civility, and mutualism. So telling this story because it's our story. It's the story of how our society functioned not that long ago, really, historically speaking. 100 years ago is the blink of an eye, right? I don't think it's impossible to start doing things like this again or start doing them more widely. Some of the stuff does go on. The Old Glory Club, as we mentioned at the event this year, had, even though we're not where we want to be in terms of setting up some mutual aid formal stuff, we already did a fundraiser for a friend in need and raised $6,500, I think it was, for him. Is that right, Ryan?
I was going to say that sounds about right, but I was going to jump in with a potentially foreshadowing comment after you were done with what you were saying there about the OGC.
Yeah, okay, yeah. But, the reason I'm talking about this, not at an OGC meeting, but on my stream, is because I am hoping that not only will some listeners get interested in forming a local Old Glory Club chapter and things like that, but just opening your mind to a way of functioning that was very normal in our societies, in the Anglosphere at least, just a century ago, is very normal. There's still bits of it around, as Clossington has shared with us in the live chat. Sorry. Another Clossington. I probably should have shared all of them. Theodore Roosevelt wrote a speech where he lauded the Masons for providing a common place in which he and his gardener could socialize without class stigma. So there were a lot of benefits to these fraternal societies. It wasn't just about pooling money in an insurance sort of thing. it was about more than that, supporting each other in a richer kind of a way. It was about having real community, right? We are sorely in need of that. And so I don't think, I would not want to discourage anyone who wanted to, you don't have to join the Old Glory Club. If you see an opportunity to start some kind of mutual aid thing, or of course, just helping out your neighbor, right? In the informal way that was so common. Even when I was a child, I saw more of this. This is a tradition to bring back, in my view. And I don't think we need to wait for anybody's permission. We don't need to wait for the federal government, certainly not. We just need to do it. Just start doing it. And we'll figure it out. We'll bumble along. We'll stumble along. I think looking at part of the reason I went through this is not just to say, hey, let's remember we used to do this, but to see some of the details. What were some of the values they emphasized? What were some of the ways they helped each other? Let's learn from that. It can give us ideas. Oh, I never thought of it being like a social thing, that maybe there'd be just not just helping each other out financially, but we just have some social gatherings, just get together sometimes, right? That I gather is really missing right now. It's really hard just to know where to hang out with some people if you want to just be social. That's getting harder in a lot of ways. So anyway, I just think there's rich depths in our own tradition that we can mine and we can draw from, and we can bring it back. I don't see why we can't. I don't think they're going to shoot us for starting a mutual aid society, Ryan?
Maybe. Having said that, and I'm sure we'll get into this as the book goes on, it is now much harder to make a formal mutual aid society for regulations and reasons that this book will delve into, and I'm sure Steve and I and other guests will later. So that is, even though you don't have to join the Old Glory Club, you should join the Old Glory Club if you want to be a part of this formal society, because it's going to take a lot of us to sort of breach these hurdles and regulations and thresholds that the federal government and other legislative bodies have set for us, sort of to crowd and weed this great tradition out. So Stephen did say it would be great for people to join or start a local Old Glory Club chapter. I would echo that, and I would in fact say that if you are interested in that and don't know what to do, it would just takes a simple email of introduction to theoldgloryclub@gmail.com, spelled exactly as you'd expect it to be, saying that you're interested, give like a general region so that we can put you into contact with people. And you can start doing that now if you're in the United States. If you're not in the United States, if you're in Canada, for instance, another part of the Anglosphere that I'm sure had some form of mutual aid, though not entirely certain about it, kind of like Stephen said at the beginning. We do have friends there starting the Red Ensign Club. That's Black Horse, Skeptical Waves, and a few others, I'm sure. And then, of course, these other flag-themed clubs would be very nice to get started in other parts of the world as well. It would be very nice to know that you have friends in specific parts of the world that might not be so friendly to you by and large, so that you know who to talk to, who to stay with, who to seek help from, that we do not necessarily have formalized right now. So that would be the reason to join. That would be the reason to start your own if you do not have a existing organization to join already. And this is a part of what this online write that usually gets derided as doing nothing and just talking all day or listening all day. It's actually trying to bring a very key tradition back that got eradicated due to state influence over the last century or so.
Thanks to Sam153 over on Subscribestar for throwing a tip. They have something like super chats on Subscribestar. Says mutual aid for stream, and also Prince of Parma here right on YouTube says have some mutual aid. So thank you, sir. And I think that's all we'll cover. Did you have any points you wanted to make before we leave this chapter behind, Ryan?
I think that I said everything that I needed to. And I don't just keep mentioning the progressives because it's the only thing I know about this era. You're going to see why they and their political and intellectual offspring are pretty important in this story of mutual aid as time goes on. Sort of setting the foundation there.
Yep. Yeah, and I guess it's a bit of a missed opportunity. I didn't have Clossington on for these first two chapters. I'll have to look at chapter 3 and see if we can still slip him in somehow, because he's got a lot of knowledge and interest in this area.
It might be good to bring him back closer to the end if we're going to do this step by step, kind of like we did with Liberty or Equality and other such books. Typically, we will delve down this rabbit hole of here's how the whole thing got destroyed, and then we'll say we need to bring it back. Might be good to have Clossington on near the end to kind of remind the audience what did we lose? What did they take from you? What are we returning to?
Right.
He can bring his side of the details if we get towards the end there.
Yep, that would be great. Yeah, thanks for your input, Clossington, in the chat, live chat. Really great stuff. I need to read back through, see what I missed. Okay, anyway, thanks to Mad Merc. It's so great to have him back. He was the original co-host of the show and had to get his career rolling, and is now, I think, in a place where he can start to join us for an hour every week again. So that's really awesome. Looking forward to his continued involvement and getting that art contest announced, which we do every year, so people can start being creative. And thanks to Ryan Turnipseed for joining as he hurtles towards another academic year.
Yeah, school starts next week.
Yeah, do we have the class schedule? Is it going to be slamming into the showtime again?
I don't actually know. I can find that really quickly, but yeah, that's for you and I to discuss later.
Yeah. Okay. All right. Anyway, thanks everybody. And, like I said in the marketing, at one time we helped each other when somebody had ran into trouble. Right. And, one more from Prince of Parma. I look forward to losing this art competition as well. All entries are greatly appreciated. Some of the ones that don't win, so we have the most fun with. So
the only way you can lose that competition is by not enjoying the review stream.
Exactly. Yeah, the review stream is so fun. Anyway, so yeah, what did I say? I'm sorry, I said it better before. We used to help each other out when someone fell on hard times, and let's do it again. That's part of the reason I'm wanting to go through all this, how we used to function, what happened to it, how can we bring it back, just like Ryan said. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining us. Talk to you next week.